Now, before understanding or before trying to configure any data guard or a standby system, we need to know what are the types of standby databases or what are the different models or different flavors of standby database we have. The first type of standby database is physical standby. In physical standby, always remember it is exactly same as your production database. When we say exactly same, it is exact copy of your production server in terms of hardware, in terms of operating system, in terms of file system structure, in terms of every transaction that happens in your production database, and also in terms of the design of your database. When we say design of the database, I mostly mean towards the data file sizes or the size of your data files. If you add one data file of 100 GB in production, that must be exactly added into your physical standby. A physical standby is nothing but a block to block copy of your production server. That is why it is known as exactly same copy of your production database. But there is one issue with physical standby. There is no queries that are allowed onto physical standby. You can configure a physical standby, but until you activate it, no queries are allowed onto physical standby. You cannot use it for reporting purpose. You cannot use it for any transaction purpose until you activate it. When we say activation, it simply means converting your physical standby into primary. Okay, let us understand this one first and then we'll continue with the types of standby databases. First of all, once again reiterating, you have your ProdDB and this is your physical standby. Physical standby. We know that physical standby is exactly same as production DB in terms of block to block. Everything that happens on production will be executed in a similar fashion onto the physical standby. So at server level and from OS level, from file system level, from database level, from OS level services, everything will be exactly same in a physical standby server. Basically, blindly you can say that physical standby is a physical copy of your production server. When we say physical, definitely internal software and everything will also be exactly same. That is the physical copy. So this is about what is physical standby. But when we see at a physical standby, remember the database or the standby database, it will always be in a mount stage. When you have a database in mount stage, can we really query the database? No, you cannot execute any queries in the database. So until you activate your physical standby, you cannot perform any queries into the standby server. Now when we say activation, it simply means that let's take clients are connected to production DB and something happens to the production site. You need to switch clients from production site to your DR site. When you switch, you have to change the role of your database from physical standby to primary. When you change the role of your physical standby from physical standby to primary, which means you have to open your database. Physical standby will always be in mount stage, but to allow users to query or perform operations, you need to open the DB. So this opening of the standby database or change in the role of the standby database is nothing but activating your standby database. If you do not activate or open your standby database, users cannot run any queries onto it, because by default, physical standby will always be in a mount state. That is physical standby. Definitely when we are on specific topic of configuration of each type of standby, we will understand more in detail. So once again, physical standby, it's exactly same as production database, and no queries allowed onto the standby database because it is in mount stage. Next, logical standby. What is this logical standby? First of all, physical standby means your standby database is exactly physical copy of your production. But when we say logical standby, it simply means that your standby database is logically similar to your production server, but when you compare exactly at physical level, the configurations might be different. So what is this logical standby? It's logically same as production DB, but if you compare both the databases, they'll be different. Also, logs continue to apply in the background. Let us understand what is logical standby. Now, when we have physical standby, nothing but physical STB, the biggest drawback is no queries. Then, see, I am not able to run any queries, then what's the use of maintaining the physical standby? It's a waste of a server, right? Is there a method with which I can use the standby server for some other purpose also? And meanwhile, it also serves as a purpose of disaster recovery system. Yes, we can do that. You have this production server, ProdDB, and you have a standby. Remember, I'm calling it only a standby server right now. Whether it is physical, logical, we'll decide in some time. I want that users must be able to connect to standby. They must be able to execute the queries. And also I want that logs to be shipped from ProdDB to logical standby, and they are also applied to the standby server. Now, if I want to have this kind of configuration, I need to set up a logical standby. In logical standby, remember this database, nothing but your standby database, which is nothing but copy of your ProdDB. This will be exactly same as ProdDB, but because users are executing multiple queries onto the standby, they can create again different table spaces in the standby database, which do not exist on the production DB. That's why logical standby is logically similar or logically same to your production DB, because every transaction that is happening is still being applied onto the logical standby. But there are some other factors, or there are some other table spaces, or there are some other users which can also exist in the logical standby, because users are still using the system and they are still executing some queries. This is logical standby. Now, the benefit of logical standby is you can use your standby DB. When we say you can use your standby DB, nothing but the log shipping will continue. Logs will still continue to be applied onto your standby database, and also users can connect to your standby database and execute some queries. This is logical standby. Next, snapshot standby. What is snapshot standby? Okay, you have a situation where you want to test something on production server. Now you don't know whether the test will succeed or not, and depending on the result of the test, you will deploy the code or you will deploy the module. Then what can be done? Is there a solution for it? Let us look at it. Once again, we have our ProdDB. Great. Now, in my environment, I do not have a test server. I do not have a dev server. I do not have a QA server to test whatever I want to test. I only have a production server, just one server, and the testing that I want to do needs to be done exactly onto the production server. I as a DBA, or I as a database developer, or maybe somebody else who's a programmer, do not know whether the test will succeed or not. If the test will succeed, then they might plan to implement it, and if they fail in the test, they might want to revert back all the changes that they have done onto the production server and let the production server continue the way it is running. To have this kind of scenario, or to solve this kind of scenario, Oracle provides something called as snapshot standby. What is a snapshot? In basic terms, when we talk about snapshot, it simply means that taking a snap or saving the image. In cameras, you have a snapshot. Nothing but for every picture that you take from your camera, it is a snap. What is the meaning of snap? Capturing the moment. Capturing the moment. When we take a snap from camera, we capture the moment and we can view the exact moment anytime, whenever we want. In software, or when it comes to IT, if you talk about snapshot, when you take a snap, it is nothing but storing the state of some application or a database. Storing the state. When we say storing the state, which means if from the time when you have taken snap, if we continue some transactions at any point of time in future, I can revert back to the snap or the snapshot wherever I have taken. The same concept is available in the virtual machines. When you run your virtual machines, you can take a snapshot and you try to execute all your transactions onto the VM. But at certain point of time you corrupted everything or something happened to your VM, you can roll back to your snap when it was taken and open your VM once again exactly at this point of time. I have ProdDB, and on this ProdDB, the first thing is I cannot test my code, or I cannot test my new application. This is ProdDB. So the solution that Oracle has is, Oracle says, okay, you create a snapshot standby. Now what is a snapshot standby? It is nothing but, snapshot standby is a physical standby, and what you can do in a physical standby, logs are coming and they are being applied onto your physical standby. But for some time what you can do is you can stop the log apply and then open the standby. Now when you open your standby, you can execute any query. We know that because now the standby is open. So what you do is you deploy your code, or you test your code, or you test your new application. Get the result for your application. Whether it is success or not, that is secondary. Once the testing is done, the best part is you can revert back to the exact time when you opened your standby, nothing but your physical standby. This is called as snapshot standby configuration. So what snapshot standby will do is, first of all, it's a physical standby, and once you open the physical standby, you can execute any transaction, And once all the transactions are executed, you can revert back to the exact time when the database was open, and the logs will continue to apply. So this is nothing but your snapshot standby. Now you will have a question, when snapshot standby is same as physical standby, then why a new name for snapshot standby? Remember, in a general case, if you do not configure a snapshot standby, if you only have a physical standby, and if you open the physical standby, you have to rebuild your entire DR. Rebuild your DR. You cannot again revert back to the stage before open and continue the logs to apply which are coming from the production. Now to solve this kind of issue, we have to configure a snapshot standby. What snapshot standby will allow us is to revert back to the exact time when we open the physical standby, and it can continue to apply all the logs that are coming from the production server. That is the benefit of snapshot standby. So once again, to reiterate what is snapshot standby is, first of all, if you want to deploy a code, if you want to test something, you cannot test it directly on the production DB. What you can do is you can open a physical standby database, you test your code, and then you can revert back to the exact time when you open your physical standby and continue the logs to apply. So you have a stable environment still, you have already tested your code, and you have results of your code testing. Now this is the solution for these kind of problems. Now the another question that you might have would be, okay, I have the physical standby and logs are already being applied. Logs are coming from ProdDB and they are being applied onto the physical standby. Great. But then how this concept of opening the standby, then reverting back, and once again the logs will continue. Let us assume on the production the log sequence is 10, 11, 12, 13. This is the log sequence which is going on to the production. You have the log number 10 which is shipped to physical standby and 10 is applied. Remember, this plus symbol is nothing but the log is already applied. You have the log number 11 coming from production and 11 is applied. You have the log number 12 coming and 12 is applied. Now at this stage you open the standby. Remember the two important services that we have in DataGuard, nothing but log shipping service and log apply service. At this stage when the log number 12 is applied already, I want to stop the log apply service. I'm telling log apply service, okay boss, stop for some time because I am opening the physical standby for some other purpose. We are stopping the log apply service, but I did not stop the log shipping service, which means the log number 13 will come from production to the DR, but it will not be applied. The same thing will continue with 14, 15 and all the logs. They will continue to come onto the physical standby, but they will never be applied. Right, because I have stopped the log apply service. Now exactly when the 12th log was applied, what I did is I opened the DB. When we open the database, there are different transactions that will happen. Nothing but you are testing your code, multiple transactions will happen, and you got the result of your application or the code. Fine, everything is great till this point. Once you revert back your DB when it was open, nothing but you are converting or you are switching the role back. When we say switching the role, From the OpenDB, you are taking it into mount stage. Why are we taking it to mount stage? Because physical standby is always in mount stage. Now when we are switching back the role, what happens is all the transactions that happened when we open the DB will be discarded, and the log apply service will be activated, which means I'll activate the log apply service, and it will continue to apply the log number 13, 14, 15, and if any other logs which have come from the production, they will be directly applied onto the DR site. Now that is how the snapshot standby will work. And finally, we have another type of standby database, that is Active Data Guard. Now before we discuss about Active Data Guard, remember it needs a special and a separate license to run Active Data Guard. Of course, it is already available in your Enterprise Edition, means that feature is already there, but to use that feature you need to have a license. Now what is this Active Data Guard? Active Data Guard is nothing but it's a standby database which will always be in an open mode. That is the first thing. And second thing, normal user transactions can also continue on the standby database. But again you will have a question, okay boss, I have the Active Data Guard enabled, but I don't see any difference between Active Data Guard and Logical Standby, because in both Active Data Guard and Logical Standby, users are able to query the standby database. Great. There is a slight difference between Logical Standby and Active Data Guard. Again, we have the first type, that is ProdDB and Logical Standby. This is my ProdDB. Remember, in Logical Standby, logically your standby database will be same as ProdDB, but along with the structure of your ProdDB, you can also have your table spaces. You can again have your users. These are the separate table spaces, separate users which are created in Logical Standby, which do not exist on the ProdDB. So logically your standby is same as your ProdDB. Now you will have a question like, what is that logically? Simple. If you have 10 table spaces, you will have those 10 table spaces over here in Logical Standby. Plus there might be some other which the users on Logical Standby have created. You have 20 tables on it on production. You might have these 20 tables on Logical Standby, plus you can have some other tables which are created by the users on Logical Standby. So likewise you can have all the objects on the production DB on the Logical Standby, plus you will have some other objects that are created by the users who access the Logical Standby. That's why this part, if you remove whatever has been created by the users on the Logical Standby, this will be exactly same as your ProdDB. And that is why this is known as Logical Standby, which means logically in terms of tables, table spaces, users, the data, internal objects of the DB will be exactly same as ProdDB. But along with the production objects, you will have few more objects that are created by the users who access the Logical Standby. This is the concept of your Logical Standby. But when it comes to Active Data Guard, there is a change in. You have your ProdDB and you have Active Data Guard, or nothing but Active Standby. On your production server, you have all the transactions that are happening, and these transactions are being applied to the standby server. Great. But you can run your standby in open mode. That is first thing. And your active standby will be exactly same as physical structure of your production DB. Exactly same. Again, block to block, everything. But again, you will have a question. When my standby is open, when users are accessing the standby database, then how come it can be exactly same as ProdDB? Remember, in active data guard, users are allowed to only query the DB. Users are not allowed to make any changes to the standby database. Okay, great. Two new features. Users can only issue the select queries, or user can only query the database, but they cannot create, or they cannot alter any objects, or they cannot add their objects of their own. Nothing can be done. Fine. They can query the DB, but then again, what's the benefit? I can query the production DB also, right? The benefit of active data guard is reporting. Let's take you have your clients who or customers who are accessing the ProdDB and they are executing all the transactions. And you also have a reporting team which generates all the reports. Reporting team. This reporting team connects to your ProdDB and it generates all the reports. Remember, reporting team will always use select queries. Why select queries? Because they are generating the reports from the existing data. They will never execute alter, create, delete, update commands. They'll only use the select statements. Right. So if you have an active data guard in place, rather than reporting team querying directly from the production DB, they can query from the standby server because it is in open mode and you are allowed to run all the select queries onto the standby. Great. That is offloading from prod. Now you will have one more question. Okay, I have active data guard, but why can't I use the same concept in other type of standbys? Now there is a slight flavor of every standby which makes it special. Now when we are using the standbys and when we are configuring those standbys, we'll once again look into the benefits and disadvantages. So more on type of standby, when we are configuring each standby, we'll understand.